Cultural Revolution and Power. Is not this Hegelian, Chestertonian shift from the criminal transgression of law and order to law and order itself as the highest criminal transgression, directly enacted by Mao? This is why, while setting in motion and secretly pulling the strings of the self-destructive carnival, Mao nonetheless remained exempted from its process. At no moment was there ever a serious threat that Mao himself would be ritualistically deposed, treated as yesterday a king, today a beggar. He was not the traditional master, but the lord of misrule. In the European Middle Ages, it was customary for great households to choose a lord of misrule. The person chosen was expected to preside over the rebels that briefly reversed or parodied the conventional social and economic hierarchies. When the brief reign of misrule was over, the customary order of things would be restored. The lords of misrule would go back to their menial occupations, while their social superiors resumed their wonted status. Sometimes the idea of lord of misrule would spill over from the realm of revel to the realm of politics. The apprentices took over from their guildmasters for a reckless day or two. Gender roles were reversed for a day as the women took over the tasks and airs normally associated only with men. Chinese philosophers also loved the paradoxes of status reversed, the ways that wit or shame could deflate pretension and lead to sudden shifts of insight. It was Mao's terrible accomplishment to seize on such insights from earlier Chinese philosophers, combine them with elements drawn from Western socialist thought, and to use both in tandem to prolong the limited concept of misrule into a long drawn-out adventure in upheaval. To Mao, the former lords and masters should never be allowed to return. He felt they were not his betters, and that society was liberated by their removal. He also thought the customary order of things should never be restored. Is, however, such a terrible accomplishment not the elementary gesture of every true revolutionary? Why make a revolution at all if we do not think that the customary order of things should never be restored? What Mao did was to deprive the transgression of its ritualized, ludic character by taking it seriously. Revolution is not just a temporary safety valve, a carnivalesque explosion destined to be followed by a process of sobering up. His problem was precisely the absence of the negation, the failure of the attempts to transpose revolutionary negativity into a truly new positive order. All temporary stabilizations of the revolution amounted to just so many restorations of the old order, so that the only way to keep the revolution alive was the spurious infinity of endlessly repeated negation, which reached its apex in the Great Cultural Revolution. In his Logique des Mondes, Badiou elaborated two subjective attitudes which counter an event: the reactive subject and the obscure subject. Insofar as one is ready to accept the risk of obscenely designating the reintroduction of capitalism into China a kind of event, one can claim that the Cultural Revolution and the revisionism identified by the name Deng Xiaoping stand, respectively, for the obscure and the reactive subject. Deng orchestrated the renaissance of capitalism in communist China, while the Cultural Revolution aimed at its total annihilation and was such precisely what Badiou calls un désert obscur. Badiou himself concedes that the final result of the Cultural Revolution was negative. It all began when, between 1966 and 1968, saturating in the real the previous hypotheses, the Red Guardist high school pupils and students, and then the workers of Shanghai, prescribed for the decades to come the affirmative realization of this beginning, of which they themselves, since their fury remained caught into what they were rising against, explored only the face of pure negation. One should take a step further here. What if the Cultural Revolution was negative, not only in the sense of clearing the space and opening up the way for a new beginning, but negative in itself, negative as an index of its impotence in generating the new? This brings us back to the central weakness of Mao's thought and politics. Many a commentator has made ironic remarks about the apparent stylistic clumsiness of the titles of Soviet communist books and articles, such as their tautological character, with the repeated use of the same word, like revolutionary dynamics in the early stages of the Russian Revolution, or economic contradictions in the development of the Soviet economy. However, what if this tautology points towards an awareness of the logic of betrayal, best rendered by the classic reproach of Robespierre to the Dantonist opportunists? What you want is a revolution without a revolution? The tautological repetition thus signals the urge to repeat the negation, to relate it to itself. The true revolution is revolution with a revolution which, in its course, revolutionizes its own starting presuppositions. Hegel had a presentiment of this necessity when he wrote, "It is a modern folly to alter a corrupt ethical system, its constitution and legislation, without changing the religion, to have a revolution without a reformation." He thereby announced the necessity of a cultural revolution as the condition for the successful social revolution. This, then, should be our precise version of Robespierre's retort. What you want is a revolution without a reformation. The problem with revolutionary attempts hitherto is thus not that they were too extreme, but that they were not radical enough, that they did not question their own presuppositions. In a wonderful essay on Chauvingur, Platonov's great peasant utopia written in 1927 and 1928, just prior to forced collectivization, Frederick Jameson describes the two moments of the revolutionary process. It begins with the gesture of radical negativity. The first moment of world reduction, of the destruction of the idols, and the sweeping away of an old world in violence and pain, is itself the precondition for the reconstruction of something else. A first moment of absolute immanence is necessary, the blank slate of absolute peasant immanence or ignorance, before new and undreamed of sensations and feelings can come into being. Then follows the second stage, the invention of a new life. Not only the construction of the new social reality in which our utopian dreams will be realized, but the reconstruction of these dreams themselves. A process that it would be too simple and misleading to call reconstruction or utopian construction, since in effect it involves the very effort to find a way to begin imagining utopia to begin with. Perhaps in a more Western kind of psychoanalytic language, we might think of the new onset of the utopian process as a kind of desiring to desire, a learning to desire, the invention of the desire called utopia in the first place, along with new rules for the fantasizing or daydreaming of such a thing. A set of narrative protocols with no precedent in our previous literary institutions. The reference to psychoanalysis is here crucial and very precise. In a radical revolution, people not only realize their old, emancipatory, etc. dreams. Rather, they have to reinvent their very modes of dreaming. Is this not the exact formula of the link between the death drive and sublimation? Therein resides the necessity of the Cultural Revolution, clearly grasped by Mao, as Herbert Marcuse put it in another marvelous circular formula from the same epoch. Freedom from ideological constraints, from the predominant mode of dreaming, is the condition of liberation. That is, if we only change reality in order to realize our dreams, and do not change these dreams themselves, sooner or later we regress back to the old reality. There is a Hegelian positing of presuppositions at work here. The hard work of liberation retroactively forms its own presupposition. It is only this reference to what happens after the revolution, to the morning after, that allows us to distinguish between pathetic libertarian outbursts and true revolutionary upheavals. The former lose their energy when one has to start the prosaic work of social reconstruction. At this point, lethargy sets in. In contrast, recall the immense creativity of the Jacobins just prior to their fall, the numerous proposals about a new civic religion, about how to defend the dignity of old people, and so on. Therein also resides the interest of reading the reports about daily life in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s, with the enthusiastic urge to invent new rules for quotidian existence. What are the new rules of courting? How should one celebrate a birthday? At this point, the Cultural Revolution miserably failed. It is difficult to miss the irony of the fact that Badiou, who adamantly opposes the notion of the act as negative, locates the historical significance of the Maoist Cultural Revolution precisely in the negative gesture of signaling the end of the party state as the central production of revolutionary political activity. It is here that he should have been consistent and denied the evental status of the Cultural Revolution. Far from being an event, it was rather a supreme display of what Badiou likes to refer to as the morbid death drive. Destroying old monuments was not a true negation of the past. It was, once again, rather an impotent passage à l'acte, bearing witness to the failure to get rid of the past. So, in a way, there is a kind of poetic justice in the fact that the final result of Mao's Cultural Revolution is today's unheard-of explosion of capitalist dynamics in China. That is to say, with the full deployment of capitalism, especially in today's late capitalism, it is the predominant normal way of life which, in a way, becomes carnivalized, with constant self-revolutionizing, reversals, crises, and reinventions. Brian Masumi clearly formulated this deadlock, which is based on the fact that contemporary capitalism has already overcome the logic of totalizing normality and adopted that of erratic excess. The more varied and even erratic, the better. Normalcy starts to lose its hold, the regularities start to loosen. This loosening of normalcy is part of capitalism's dynamic. It's not a simple liberation, it's capitalism's own form of power. It's no longer disciplinary institutional power that defines everything. It's capitalism's power to produce variety, because markets get saturated. Produce variety, and you produce a niche market. The oddest of effective tendencies are okay, as long as they pay. Capitalism starts intensifying or diversifying affect, but only in order to extract surplus value. It hijacks affect in order to intensify profit potential. It literally valorizes affect. The capitalist logic of surplus value production starts to take over the relational field that is also the domain of political ecology, the ethical field of resistance to identity, and predictable paths. It's very troubling and confusing because it seems to me that there's been a certain kind of convergence between the dynamic of capitalist power and the dynamic of resistance. There is, thus, beyond all cheap jibes and superficial analogies, a profound structural homology between Maoist permanent self-revolutionizing, the continuous struggle against the ossification of state structures, and the inherent dynamics of capitalism. One is tempted to paraphrase Brecht here. His "What is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a new bank?" Yet again, what are the violent and destructive outbursts of a red guardist caught up in the Cultural Revolution compared to the true Cultural Revolution? The permanent dissolution of all life forms necessitated by capitalist reproduction. Today, the tragedy of the Great Leap Forward itself is repeating itself as the farce of the capitalist Great Leap Forward into modernization, with the old slogan, "An iron foundry in every village," re-emerging as a skyscraper in every street. It is the reign of contemporary global capitalism which is the true lord of misrule. No wonder, then, that in order to curb the excess of social disintegration caused by the capitalist explosion, Chinese officials celebrate religions and traditional ideologies which sustain social stability, from Buddhism to Confucianism. That is, the very ideologies that were the target of the Cultural Revolution. In April 2006, Yi Qiaowen, China's top religious official, told the Xinhua news agency that religion is one of the important forces from which China draws strength, and he singled out Buddhism for its unique role in promoting a harmonious society, the official formula for combining economic expansion with social development and care. The same week, China hosted the World Buddhist Forum. The role of religion as a stabilizing force against capitalist turbulence is thus officially sanctioned. What bothers the Chinese authorities in the case of sects like Falun Gong is merely their independence from state control. This is why one should also reject the argument that the Cultural Revolution strengthened socialist attitudes among the people, and thus helped to curb the worst disintegrative excesses of today's capitalist development. Quite the contrary, by undermining traditional stabilizing ideologies such as Confucianism, it rendered the people all the more vulnerable to the dizzying effects of capitalism. It is against this background that one should read the recent great campaign in China to resuscitate Marxism as effective state ideology. Literally hundreds of millions of US dollars are being invested in this venture. Those who see in this operation a threat to capitalist liberalization, a sign that hardliners want to reassert their hegemony, are totally missing the point. Paradoxical as it might sound, this return of Marxism is the sign of the ultimate triumph of capitalism, the sign of its thoroughgoing institutionalization. Recent legal measures which guarantee private property, hailed by the West as a crucial step towards legal stability, are part of the same thrust. That is to say, what kind of Marxism is being offered as appropriate for today's China? Emphasis is on the distinction between Marxism and leftism. Marxism is not the same as leftism, a term which refers to any talk of workers' liberation, from free trade unions to the overcoming of capitalism. Based on the Marxist thesis of the development of the forces of production as the key factor of social progress, the main task of progressive forces is defined as that of creating the conditions for the continuing rapid modernization, while avoiding all forms of instability, those caused by leftism, as well as those caused by rightism, campaigns for multi-party democracy, and so on, which will bring chaos and thus hinder the very modernization process. The conclusion is clear. In today's China, only the leading role of the Communist Party can sustain a rapid transformation of the conditions of social stability. The official Confucian term is that China should become a harmonious society. Consequently, to put it in the old Maoist terms, although it may appear that the main enemy is the bourgeois threat, the principal contradiction is, in the eyes of the ruling elite, the one between the existing harmonious order, unfettered capitalist development sustained by Communist Party rule, and the threat of workers' and peasants' revolts, which is why the recent strengthening of the oppressive apparatuses, the formation of special units of riot police to crush popular unrest and so forth, is the actual social expression of what, in ideology, appears as a revival of Marxism. The problem with this revival is that, to put it in Kant's terms, it totally subordinates Marxism to the private use of reason. For Kant, the public space of the world civil society designates the paradox of universal singularity, of a singular subject who, in a kind of short circuit, bypassing the mediation of the particular, directly participates in the universal. This is what Kant, in the famous passage of his What is Enlightenment, means by public as opposed to private. Private is not one's individual as opposed to communal ties, but the very communal institutional order of one's particular identification, while public is the transnational universality of the exercise of reason. The public use of one's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among men. The private use of one's reason, on the other hand, may often be very narrowly restricted without particularly hindering the progress of enlightenment. By public use of one's reason, I understand the use which a person makes of it as a scholar before the reading public. Private use I call that which one may make of it in a particular civil post or office which is entrusted to him. The paradox of Kant's formula, think freely but obey, is thus that one participates in the universal dimension of the public sphere precisely as a singular individual extracted from or even opposed to one's substantial communal identification. One is truly universal only when radically singular, in the interstices of communal identities. Coming back to contemporary China, the artificially resuscitated form of Marxism is an exemplary case of the private use of reason. Marxism is mobilized not on account of its inherent universal truth, but in order to legitimize the present Chinese state interest of maintaining Communist Party power and thus guaranteeing stability in a period of fast-moving economic development. Such a use of Marxism is objectively cynical, with no cognitive value at all. The tragedy is that the Chinese state will sooner or later encounter the limits of the formula capitalism with Confucian values. And at that point, only an unconstrained public use of reason will be able to do the job of inventing new solutions. No wonder that, in today's China, the The two terms public intellectual and civil society are very negatively viewed in official eyes, although they are not explicitly prohibited. Every intellectual knows that it is better to avoid them if one wants to remain on good terms with those in power. Anything, almost, is permitted in closed academic debates, that is, as long as it does not reach the general public. The paradoxical status of contemporary Chinese Marxism is conditioned by the fact that China in the 21st century is indeed no longer a totalitarian state, but rather what some would call an authoritarian state. There are passionate public debates, different opinions on key issues are openly defended, but within very precise limits. One cannot directly put into question the Communist Party's political monopoly. While one can draw attention to ecological problems, one is obliged to do it with great restraint, avoiding hot topics like the gigantic Yellow River Dam. Although one can write about the terrible conditions of unskilled manual workers, one should treat it as a local anomaly and never propose the formation of any type of workers' defense organization, such as independent labor unions. And one is often compelled to use a coded language, such as formulating a critique of socialism as advocacy of one socialist orientation against another one. How then do leading communist theorists react when confronted with the all too obvious contradiction? A communist party which still legitimizes itself in Marxist terms, but renounces Marxism's basic premise, that of work as self-organization, as a revolutionary force in order to overthrow capitalism. It is difficult to avoid the impression that all the resources of the legendary form of Chinese politeness are mobilized here. It is considered impolite to directly raise or insist on these questions. This resort to politeness is necessary, since it is the only way to combine what cannot be combined. To enforce Marxism as official ideology while openly prohibiting its central axioms would cause the collapse of the entire ideological edifice, thereby rendering it meaningless. The result is thus that, while certain things are clearly prohibited, this prohibition cannot be publicly stated, but is itself prohibited. It is not merely prohibited to raise the question of workers' self-organization against capitalist exploitation as the central tenet of Marxism. It is also prohibited to publicly claim that it is prohibited to raise this question. What one usually hears from theorists is a private admission that, of course, this is contradictory, but that, nonetheless, such a contradictory ideological edifice works, and works spectacularly. It is the only way to ensure fast economic growth and stability in China. Need we add that this is the private use of reason at its purest? This paradox is nicely rendered in the title of a recent report on China. Even what's secret is a secret in China. Many troublesome intellectuals who report on political oppression, ecological catastrophes, rural poverty, and so on, for example, a Chinese woman who sent her husband, who lives abroad, clippings from a local Chinese newspaper, suffer years of imprisonment for betraying state secrets. However, many of the laws and regulations that make up the state secret regime are themselves classified, making it difficult for individuals to know how and when they're in violation. This secrecy of the prohibition itself serves two different purposes which should not be confused. Its commonly admitted role is that of universalizing guilt and fear. If you do not know what is prohibited, you cannot even know when you are violating a prohibition, which makes you potentially guilty all the time. Of course, things are more precise here. Except at the climax of the Stalinist purges, when, effectively, everyone could be found guilty, people do know when they are doing something that will annoy those in power. The function of prohibiting prohibitions is thus not to give rise to irrational fears, but to let the potential dissidents, who think they can get away with their critical activity, since they are not breaking any laws, but only doing what laws guarantee them, freedom of opinion, and so on, know that if they irk those in power too much, they can be punished at the latter's whim. Don't provoke us. We can do whatever we want to you. No laws are protecting you here. In ex-Yugoslavia, the infamous Article 133 of the Penal Code could always be invoked to prosecute writers and journalists. It criminalized any text that falsely presented the achievements of the socialist revolution or that might arouse tension and discontent among the public due to the way it dealt with political, social, or other topics. This last category is obviously not only infinitely plastic, but also conveniently self-referential. Does not the very fact that you are accused by those in power obviously mean that you have aroused tension and discontent among the public? During those years, I remember asking a Slovene politician how he justified this law. He just smiled and with a wink told me, well, we have to have some tool to discipline when we want those who annoy us. But there is another function of prohibiting prohibitions which is no less crucial, that of maintaining appearances. And we all know how absolutely crucial appearances were under Stalinism. The Stalinist regime reacted with total panic whenever there was a threat that appearances would be disturbed. Say that some accident which made clear the failure of the regime might be reported in the public media. There were, in the Soviet media, no black chronicles, no reports on crimes and prostitution, not to mention workers or other types of public protests. Which is why this prohibition of prohibitions is far from limited to communist regimes. It is operative also in today's permissive capitalism. A postmodern boss insists that he is not a master, but just a coordinator of our joint creative efforts, the first among equals. There should be no formalities among us. We should address him by his nickname. He shares a dirty joke with us. But during all this, he remains our master. In such a social link, relations of domination function through their denial. In order to be operative, they have to be ignored. We are not only obliged to obey our masters, we are also obliged to act as if we were free and equal, as if there was no domination, which of course makes the situation even more humiliating. Paradoxically, in such a situation, the first act of liberation is to demand from the master that he act like one. One should reject false collegiality from the master and insist that he treat us with cold distance as a master. The same goes for patriarchal domination over women. In modern societies, this domination is no longer admitted as such, which is why one of the subversive tactics of feminine resistance is mockingly to act as if subordinated. Things go even deeper here. The ultimate ground of this paradox is the shift in social relations that occurs with the rise of capitalism itself. One should apply here Marx's old formula of commodity fetishism, in which relations between people appear as relations between things. This is why, in capitalism, we are as people, as persons, all equal, possessing the same dignity and freedom. The relations of domination, which were in previous societies directly hierarchical relations among persons, are now transposed onto relations between things, commodities. The logic of domination, which necessarily denies itself as domination, is inscribed into the very core of capitalist relations. What one should bear in mind is that while every social structure relies on certain exclusions and prohibitions, this exclusionary logic is always redoubled. Not only is the subordinated other, homosexuals, non-white races, excluded, repressed, the excluding and repressive power itself relies on an excluded, repressed, obscene content of its own. Say, the exercise of power that legitimizes itself as legal, tolerant, Christian, relies on a set of publicly disavowed obscene rituals of violent humiliation of the subordinated. More generally, we are dealing here with what one is tempted to call the ideological practice of disidentification. That is to say, one should turn around the standard notion of ideology as providing a firm identification for its subjects, constraining them to their social roles. What if, at a different, but no less irrevocable and structurally necessary level, ideology is effected precisely by way of constructing a space of false disidentification, of false distance towards the actual coordinates of the subject's social existence? Is this logic of disidentification not discernible from the most elementary case of I am not only an American, husband, worker, Democrat, gay man, but beneath all these roles and masks, a human being, a complex and unique personality, where the very distance towards the symbolic feature that determines my social place guarantees the effectiveness of this determination, up to the more complex case of cyberspace, playing with one's multiple identities. The mystification operative in the perverse just gaming of cyberspace is thus double. Not only are the games we are playing in it more serious than we tend to assume, is it not that in the guise of a fiction of it's just a game, a subject can articulate and stage sadistic, perverse, and so on, features of his symbolic identity that he would never be able to admit in his real intersubjective context. But the opposite also holds. That is, the much celebrated playing with multiple shifting personae, freely constructed identities, tends to obfuscate and thus falsely liberate us from the constraints of social space in which our existence is caught. This long detour brings us back to the paradox of contemporary Chinese Marxism. It is easy, from the standpoint of libertarian Western Marxism, to mock this Marxism, which dispenses with Marxism's central emancipatory premise, a truly decaffeinated Marxism deprived of its subversive core. However, any direct ironic critique of this new Chinese state ideology Marxism misses the point, which is that we are not dealing with a simple betrayal of Marxism, but literally with its symptom, a formula to resolve its inconsistency. There effectively was, in original Marxism itself, a dimension which potentially led to the enslavement of the workers to progress, the rapid development of the forces of production. While under Stalinism this progress was organized within the framework of the centralized state economy, today's China draws the logical conclusion that the most efficient motor of development are capitalist relations of production. The premise of classical Marxism, up to and including Tony Negri, was that history is on our side. Workers' resistance to capitalism objectively serves an even faster development of the forces of production. It is itself a sign that capitalism is no longer a motor, but more and more an obstacle to this development. What to do then when capitalism de facto proves itself as the most effective motor of social relations? The answer is the Chinese solution. To honestly admit that, in this phase of world history, we should fully embrace capitalism. Where Marxism enters is in the claim that only the leading role of the Communist Party can sustain such modernization and simultaneously maintain a harmonious society. That is, prevent the social disintegration that characterizes Western liberal capitalism. This capitalist reappropriation of revolutionary dynamics is not without its comic side effects. It was recently made public that, in order to conceptualize the Israeli Defense Forces' urban warfare against the Palestinians, the IDF military academics systematically refer to Deleuze and Guattari, especially to Thousand Plateaus, using it as operational theory. The catchwords used are formless rival entities, fractal maneuver, velocity versus rhythms, the Wahhabi war machine, postmodern anarchists, nomadic terrorists. One of the key distinctions they rely on is the one between smooth and striated space, which reflect the organizational concepts of the war machine and the state apparatus. The IDF now often uses the term to smooth out space when they want to refer to operation in a space as if it had no borders. Palestinian areas are thought of as striated in the sense that they are enclosed by fences, walls, ditches, roadblocks, and so on. The attack conducted by units of the IDF on the city of Nablus in April 2002 was described by its commander, Brigadier General Aviv Kokavi, as inverse geometry, which he explained as the reorganization of the urban syntax by means of a series of micro-tactical actions. During the battle, soldiers moved within the city across hundreds of meters of overground tunnels carved out through a dense and contiguous urban structure. Although several thousand soldiers and Palestinian guerrillas were maneuvering simultaneously in the city, they were so saturated into the urban fabric that very few would have been visible from the air. Furthermore, they used none of the city's streets, roads, alleys, or courtyards, or any of the external doors, internal stairwells, and windows, but moved horizontally through walls, and vertically through holes blasted in ceilings and floors. This form of movement, described by the military as infestation, seeks to redefine inside as outside, and domestic interiors as thoroughfares. The IDF strategy of walking through walls involves a conception of the city as not just the site, but also the very medium of warfare, a flexible, almost liquid medium that is forever contingent and in flux. So what follows from all this? Not, of course, the nonsensical accusation that Deleuze and Guattari are theorists of militaristic colonization, but the conclusion that the conceptual machinery articulated by Deleuze and Guattari far from being simply subversive, also fits the military, economic, and ideologico-political operational mode of contemporary capitalism. How then are we to revolutionize an order whose very principle is constant self-revolutionizing? Although a failure, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, GPCR, was unique in attacking the key point. Not just the takeover of state power, but the new economic organization and reorganization of daily life. Its failure was precisely the failure to create a new form of everyday life. It remained a carnivalesque excess, with the state apparatus, under Zhu Enlai's control, guaranteeing the reproduction and maintenance of everyday life, of production. At the level of social reality, there is obviously some truth to the claim that the Cultural Revolution was triggered by Mao in order to establish his power, which had been seriously curtailed in the early 1960s, in the aftermath of the spectacular failure of the Great Leap Forward, when the majority of nomenclatura staged a silent inner-party coup against him. It is true that the Cultural Revolution brought incalculable suffering, that it cut deep wounds in the social fabric, that its story can be told as the story of fanatical crowds chanting slogans. However, this is not simply the entire story. In spite of, or rather because of, all its horrors, the Cultural Revolution undoubtedly did contain elements of an enacted utopia. At its very end, before the agitation was blocked by Mao himself, since he had by then achieved his goal of re-establishing his influence and getting rid of the top nomenclatura competitors, there was the Shanghai Commune. 1 million workers who simply took the official slogan seriously, demanding the abolition of the state and even the party itself, and the direct communal organization of society. It is significant that it was at this very point that Mao ordered the army to intervene and to restore order. The paradox is that of a leader who triggers an uncontrolled upheaval while trying to exert full personal power. The overlapping of extreme dictatorship with extreme emancipation of the masses. The argument that the GPCR was triggered by Mao in order to get rid of rivals in the inner-party struggle and reassert his authority, and that it was tamed by the intervention of the army the moment it threatened to spiral out of control, is irrelevant here. Even if true, it simply confirms that the events acquired a dynamic of their own. This genuinely revolutionary aspect of the Cultural Revolution is sometimes admitted even by conservative critics compelled to take note of the paradox of the totalitarian leader, teaching people to think and act for themselves, to rebel and destroy the very apparatus of totalitarian domination. Here is what Gordon Chang recently wrote in the conservative journal Commentary. Paradoxically, it was Mao himself, the great enslaver, who in his own way taught the Chinese people to think and act for themselves. In the Cultural Revolution, he urged tens of millions of radical youths to go to every corner of the country to tear down ancient temples, destroy cultural relics, and denounce their elders, including not only mothers and fathers, but also government officials and Communist Party members. The Cultural Revolution may have been Mao's idea of ruining his enemies, but it became a frenzy that destroyed the fabric of society. As government broke down, its functions taken over by revolutionary committees and people's communes, the strict restraints and repressive mechanisms of the state dissolved. People no longer had to wait for someone to instruct them what to do. Mao had told them they had the right to rebel. For the radical young, this was a time of essentially unrestrained passion. In one magnificent stroke, the great helmsman had delegitimized almost all forms of authority. What this means is that we can read the Cultural Revolution at two different levels. If we read it as part of historical reality, being, we can easily submit it to a dialectical analysis, which perceives the final outcome of a historical process as its truth. The ultimate failure of the Cultural Revolution bears witness to the inherent inconsistency of the very project, notion of Cultural Revolution. It is the explication, deployment, actualization of these inconsistencies, in the same way that, for Marx, the vulgar, non-heroic, capitalist daily reality of profit-seeking is the truth of noble Jacobin revolutionary heroism. If, however, we analyze it as an event, as an enactment of the eternal idea of egalitarian justice, then the ultimate factual result of the Cultural Revolution, its catastrophic failure and reversal into the recent capitalist transformation, does not exhaust the real of the Cultural Revolution. The eternal idea of the Cultural Revolution survives its defeat in socio-historical reality. It continues to lead an underground spectral life of the ghosts of failed utopias which haunt the future generations, patiently awaiting their next resurrection. This brings us back to Robespierre, who expressed in a touching way the simple faith in the eternal idea of freedom, which persists through all defeats, without which, as was clear to Robespierre, a revolution is just a noisy crime that destroys another crime. The faith most poignantly expressed in Robespierre's very last speech on 8 Thermidor 1794, the day before his arrest and execution. But there do exist, I can assure you, souls that are feeling and pure. It exists, that tender, imperious, and irresistible passion, the torment and delight of magnanimous hearts, that deep horror of tyranny, that compassionate zeal for the oppressed, that sacred love for the homeland, that even more sublime and holy love for humanity, without which a great revolution is just a noisy crime that destroys another crime. It does exist, that generous ambition to establish here on earth the world's first republic. Does the same not hold, even more so, for the last big installment in the life of this idea, the Maoist Cultural Revolution? Without this idea, which sustained revolutionary enthusiasm, the Cultural Revolution was to an even greater degree just a noisy crime that destroys another crime. One should recall here Hegel's sublime words on the French Revolution from his Lectures on the Philosophy of World History. It has been said that the French Revolution resulted from philosophy, and it is not without reason that philosophy has been called Weltweisheit, world wisdom. For it is not only truth in and for itself as the pure essence of things, but also truth in its living form, as exhibited in the affairs of the world. We should not, therefore, contradict the assertion that the revolution received its first impulse from philosophy. Never since the sun had stood in the firmament and the planets revolved around him had it been perceived that man's existence centers in his head, i.e. in thought, inspired by which he builds up the world of reality. Not until now has man advanced to the recognition of the principle that thought ought to govern spiritual reality. This was accordingly a glorious mental dawn, all thinking being shared in the jubilation of this epoch. Emotions of a lofty character stirred men's minds at that time. A spiritual enthusiasm thrilled through the world, as if the reconciliation between the divine and the secular was now first accomplished. This, of course, did not prevent Hegel from coldly analyzing the inner necessity of this explosion of abstract freedom in turning into its opposite, self-destructive revolutionary terror. However, one should never forget that Hegel's critique is imminent, accepting the basic principles of the French Revolution and its key supplement, the Haitian Revolution, and one should proceed in exactly the same way apropos the October Revolution and later the Chinese Revolution. It was, as Badiou pointed out, the first case in the entire history of humanity of the successful revolt of the exploited poor. They were the zero-level members of the new society. They set the standards. The revolution stabilized itself into a new social order. A new world was created and miraculously survived for decades amid unthinkable economic and military pressure and isolation. This was effectively a glorious mental dawn, all thinking being shared in the jubilation of this epoch. Against all hierarchical orders, egalitarian universality directly came to power. There is a basic philosophical dilemma which underlies this alternative. It may seem that the only consistent Hegelian standpoint is the one which measures the notion by the success or failure of its actualization, so that, in the perspective of the total mediation of the essence by its appearance, any transcendence of the idea over its actualization is discredited. The consequence of this is that if we insist on the eternal idea, which survives its historical defeat, this necessarily entails, in Hegelese, a regression from the level of the notion as the fully actualized unity of essence and appearance to the level of the essence supposed to transcend its appearance. Is it really so, however? One can also claim that the excess of the utopian idea that survives its historical defeat does not contradict the total mediation of idea and its appearance. The basic Hegelian insight according to which the failure of reality to fully actualize an idea is simultaneously the failure, limitation, of this idea itself continues to hold. What one should simply add is that the gap that separates the idea from its actualization signals a gap within this idea itself. This is why the spectral idea that continues to haunt historical reality signals the falsity of the new historical reality itself, its inadequacy to its own notion. The failure of the Jacobin utopia, its actualization in utilitarian bourgeois reality, is simultaneously the limitation of this reality itself. Consequently, one should invert the commonplace reading of Lacan's Kant avec Sade, according to which Sadean perversion is the truth of Kant, more radical than Kant, that it draws out the consequences Kant himself did not have the courage to confront. But we would claim the contrary. Sadean perversion emerges as the result of the Kantian compromise, of Kant's avoidance of the consequences of his breakthrough. Sade is the symptom of Kant. While it is true that Kant retreated from drawing all the consequences of his ethical revolution, the space for the figure of Sade is opened up by this Kantian compromise, by his unwillingness to push through to the end, to retain full fidelity to his philosophical breakthrough. Far from being simply and directly the truth of Kant, Sade is the symptom of Kant's betrayal of the truth of his own discovery. The obscene Sadean jouisseur is a stigma bearing witness to Kant's ethical compromise, the apparent radicality of this figure. The willingness of the Sadean hero to go to the end in his will to enjoy is a mask of its exact opposite. In other words, the true horror is not a Sadean orgy, but the real core of the Kantian ethic itself. If we can be forgiven paraphrasing Brecht yet again, what is the miserable evil of a Sadean group orgy in comparison with the diabolical evil that pertains to a pure ethical act? And, mutatis mutandis, the same applies to the relationship between the Chinese Cultural Revolution and today's explosion of capitalist development as its truth. This explosion is also a sign that Mao retreated from drawing all the consequences of the Cultural Revolution. That is, the space for the capitalist explosion was opened up by this compromise, by Mao's unwillingness to push through to the end, to retain full fidelity to the idea of the Cultural Revolution. And the lesson is, in both cases, that of Kant as well as that of Mao. The same, namely that we take from Beckett's Worstward Ho. Try again, fail better.